Hello, my name is Edvaldo Silva-Jr. and today my talk is about my master's degree project named as Latitude, Climate and Biodiversity. What factors influence song complexity in a tropical bird? We know that different factors can influence song variations and complexity. For example, habitat features, climate, and song learning. For broad geographical ranges, two main sets of hypotheses are commonly used to explain song variation and increase song complexity. The ecological hypotheses predict that greater acoustic space availability provide ideal conditions for the evolution of more complex songs. On the other hand, sexual selection hypotheses predict that higher levels, higher intensity of sexual selection would favor the evolution of more complex songs too. One important detail here is that in environments with greater seasonality, birds have less time to reproduce and therefore elaborate traits that indicate partner quality, such as complex songs, would be favored by sexual selection. Okay, so greater acoustic space availability and higher levels, high intensity of sexual selection might have favored the evolution of more complex songs at higher latitudes in environments with greater climate seasonality and in species-poor habitats where less species occupy the acoustic space available. Here, we investigated song variation in the blue-black grassquit, a tropical bird that occurs from Mexico to Argentina and that produces a one-type song that is remarkably variable among individuals and even at the same site. Considering the ecological and sexual selection hypothesis, we investigated the relationship between song metrics of this species and latitude, climate seasonality, and bird species richness. Our predictions were that song complexity would positively correlate with latitude and climate seasonality, but negatively correlate with bird species richness. Okay, we calculated 8 song metrics, and 5 of them are commonly used to represent song complexity: song duration, frequency bandwidth, entropy, number of frequency inflections per second, and number of components. In this case, vibratos, arabesques, and isolated modulations. We also measure additional metrics that are potential targets of sexual selection and ecological pressures: song rate, proportional vibratos, and medium frequency. We collected recordings from online databases: Zinocanto, Macaulay Library, Wikiavis, and Fonoteca Neotropical Jacques Vieillard. And we retrieved climate seasonality data from the World Climate Database, more specifically temperature and precipitation seasonality. We also collected data about bird species richness from the Biodiversity mapping website. For the acoustic analysis, we use Raven Pro and the R environment, mainly the Warbler package. And for the statistical analysis, we fed generalized square models and spatial models. And we adopted 2 main approaches for this study. We first investigated the relationship between song metrics and latitude, and after, the relationship between song metrics and climate seasonality and bird species richness. And we also consider a hemisphere as a predictor factor. Okay, let's start with song features against latitude. Okay. Remember, our prediction was that song complexity would be positively correlated with latitude. And we found that for the northern hemisphere, inflections per second and frequency bandwidth decreased as a function of latitude, contrary to our expectations, but proportional vibratos increased as a function of latitude. For the southern hemisphere, we found that inflections per second increased with latitude, but duration decreased. Okay. Regarding song complexity metrics, we basically found that song complexity in the blue-black grassquit decreased as a function of latitude, a pattern that is contradictory with our hypothesis based on ecological and sexual selection pressures. For song features against seasonality and bird species richness, we found that, first remember, our predictions were that song complexity would positively correlate with climate variability, but negatively correlate with bird species richness. Starting with species richness, we found that inflections per second positively correlated with bird species richness, a pattern that is contrary to our expectations of more complex songs in species-poor habitats. Here, in other words, the blue-black grassquit sing songs with higher concentration of frequency modulations per unit of time, where this species, where this grassquit coexist with more bird species. In such a condition, in such a context, in such a condition, that more species may be competing for the acoustic space, it could be worthwhile for the bird to compress signal information per unit of time to improve its acoustic communication. Okay, regarding climate seasonality, we found the duration and number of components decrease as a function of climate seasonality, and this is a pattern that is also contrary to our expectations based on sexual selection pressures. But proportion of vibratos increased as a function of climate seasonality, both temperature and precipitation seasonality. We also found, although not the focus of this study, that for some metrics, entropy, bandwidth, number of components, and proportion of vibratos, that they differ between hemispheres, and probably differences between these hemispheres regarding land masses and ocean features might have influenced song evolution of the blue-black grassquit and probably other bird species too. Okay, to conclude, the blue-black grassquit song complexity and structure vary as a function of latitude, climate seasonality, bird species richness, and hemispheres. However, the ecological and sexual selection hypotheses do not fully explain song variation in the blue-black grassquit, and other factors might also have influenced the evolution of song variation and song complexity in this species. For example, historical isolation of populations, behaviors such as migration, and even food availability. Future studies in the scale that we investigated and future field studies will be necessary to better understand patterns of song evolution in the blue-black grassquit. Here, I want to thank Professor Regina Macedo and Dr. Pedro Diniz. Both of them helped me a lot during the development of my master's degree project. I would also like to thank the graduate program in ecology at the University of Brasilia for the logistic and financial support, and CAPS for the scholarship. I would also like to thank the staff from Line Databases who collected data and the bird watchers that shared the recordings. And finally, thank you for your time and attention. And if you have any doubt, please ask me now if possible or send me a message. Thank you.